Hi, everybody, and welcome to this webinar today. On behalf of my colleagues from the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, welcome. My name is Orly Barnett. I'm the Education Director at the center. Thank you for joining us from all over the world, and please feel free to use our chat box option to share which country or city you are joining us from. I know that we have visitors from both sides of the continent and both sides of the world, so please do share. I'd like to welcome our special guests, Rael Herzel and Mitch Kreitenberg, who are joining us along with their friends and families and colleagues. And I would like to also express a special thank you to our founding director, Myra Osran, who is joining us here today. Myra has been so instrumental in making the connections that have made today's webinar possible. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the deportations of Jews from Hungary. It was at this time when Germany was losing the war, and yet it was still intent on decimating any remaining Jewish populations across Europe. Justine, if we can share the PowerPoint. Thank you. From May to July of 1944, Hungarian gendarmerie officials, under the guidance of the Nazi SS, deported approximately 440,000 Jews from Hungary. Jewish victims were forced to embark on an excruciating journey via cattle trucks to the Nazi death camp of Auschwitz Birkenau in Poland. For this large-scale deportation, a special rail line was extended from the railway station outside the camp to a specially built ramp inside Birkenau. After a so-called selection process on the ramp, the majority of the new arrivals were sent to be killed in gas chambers by SS functionaries. Can we have the next slide? Evidence of the process of arrival in the camp, the selections for forced labor, for those considered fit to work, or for death, and the plunder of belongings are all recorded in the so-called Auschwitz Album, the cover of which you can see on the screen now. It is a unique document in that it is the only surviving visual evidence of the process leading to mass murder at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And we'll see in the next slide some photographs from the album, which have now all been digitized by Yad Vashem Memorial Museum and can be found online on their website. This document is assumed to have been created as some sort of report or reference for higher Nazi authorities, and thus the pictures do not depict any of the real abject horror and emotional turmoil of the victims as they are forced through the process of selection and separation from their families upon their arrival. Thus, we thought it was important to have some of these testimonies shared with us today. Our first guest is Hungarian Holocaust survivor Rael Herzel, and you can see in the pictures in the next slide, Rael is from the old city of Jerusalem. She is going to be online with us with her daughters Tova and Miriam. Rael and her husband Moshe, also a survivor from Hungary, came to Cape Town with a young family in the 1960s and early 1970s. Moshe was a spiritual leader at Rondebosch Shul, and Rael taught grade 1 and 2 Hebrew at Constantia Primary, and here you can see a photo of her when she was a teacher. And on the right-hand side of the photograph is a picture of Malcolm, who is the son of Myra Osran, who I mentioned earlier. Rael also came and spent time at our center, and you can see a picture of her in the right-hand side of the screen at the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center with survivor Miriam Lichterman from Poland, as well as delegates who were joining a program from the South African police forces. In the next slide, you'll see a yellow armband that was worn by Moshe, Rael's husband, who was a forced laborer or prisoner in Hungary. And this yellow armband is still featured in the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center's permanent exhibition today. In the section on the death camps in our exhibition, we also have a new presentation, which is the testimony of Rael. We'll see that on the next slide. And it is featured alongside photos taken in the Auschwitz Album. So this whole section of our exhibition has to do with arrival in the death camps, using Auschwitz as a case study and using the pictures from the Auschwitz Album to illustrate what happened on arrival in the camps. Rael was interviewed by Les Glassman from South Africa, and we would like to extend our huge and grateful thanks to Les for allowing us to use this essential footage in our exhibition. In this photograph, you can see our docent, one of our docents, Vivian Baskin, who's sharing Rael's testimony with a group of school learners who came to the exhibition last week. Rael's account of her survival in the camp really brings to life the Auschwitz Album photographs that surround the video in the exhibition. And so now what we would like to do is share a very short clip of Viv explaining the section of the exhibition to learners with the use of Rael's testimony.
Her name is Rael Herzel, and there she is. We managed last week, to see her, to visit her. She's living in Jerusalem. She's in her 90s. She's totally compos mentis. She speaks about her particular voyage, and her voyage links up with everything that you see here. She remembers getting out of the trains, those cattle trucks, and being divided into groups as there are, men on the one side, women on the other side. But just before that happened, is exactly what you see on the wall. She talks about the two different sides where people were separated, men and women. She talks about the chaos at the time, and an incident which saved her was that before they got into the
Thank you, Justine. So what we just saw there was a few seconds, 30 seconds of our docent, Vivian Baskin, sharing the section of the exhibition with the learners and using Rael's video testimony to illustrate what happened on arrival in the camps. We thought that it would be useful to share this testimony directly with our viewers so that you could hear it. And the full exhibition, the full testimony is about an hour and a half. It can be found on YouTube on the channel of Les Glassman. If you type in Rael Herzel testimony, you will find it. But today we thought we would share with you a 20-minute segment of Rael's story and her accounts and experiences during the Holocaust. After the 20-minute video, we will have an opportunity to meet Rael live with her daughters in the Old City of Jerusalem. And if you have any questions for Rael or her family while you are watching this video, please feel free to add them to our chat or Q&A, and we will ask them to her after the clip. Thank you.
I had a happy childhood. I had a lot of love, but during the time it started all sorts of anti-Jewish legislations, like they had nothing what to do with anything else. I mean that soldiers were marching and singing anti-Jewish songs, or something to make fun of Jews. I still remember the song. I can't sing, and you people don't know Hungarian, so. And all sorts of rules, like most of the Jews were little shopkeepers. So a Jew is not allowed to sell a certain something. So, and then something else. So slowly nobody went into a Jewish shop. Then it came a new rule with a yellow star. The Germans came in before Pesach. They looked like people. So somehow it made us feel, I don't know how my parents felt, and I don't know what they knew. Then the drummer came, and of the voice of the drum, people came out of the houses. And what did he have to say? The Jews are not allowed to leave their homes. And they took us to another place, and from there with a train to Ghetto Merkazi, where all the Jews from the surrounding were there. We were there for a month. In one room we were us and another family, and then they took us. We were the first transport. And I can't remember how many, but at least 60 people they put into a low carriage.
It's like a kettle truck. A
kettle train.
Kettle train.
It has a small little window, and we took some food with us, but we didn't take water. And there was some kind of a clay, to like make a vessel,
yeah.
And if you could sit down and you got up, you couldn't sit down anymore. It was packed. We had no idea where we are going. We had no idea, and we had no water. So if you don't drink, you can't eat. So at least you didn't have to use that thing what they put there for a toilet. Later on I heard that my mother said to somebody, if they are going to divide us, she won't be able to survive. I can't remember if it was 3 days or 4 days we were traveling, and we arrived somewhere. We had no idea where we are. And but they opened the, how did you say?
The kettle truck.
The kettle truck. And they say, schnell, schnell, quickly, get out, leave everything, you'll get it later. And some Jews from Poland with striped clothes were walking there, and in Yiddish, they were actually, if they would have been caught, I think they would be murdered. They said, "Geht's the Kinder zu the Kleine, zu the Alte, give the children to the old ones." But we didn't know why and what. I don't think there were too many people who gave their children to the old ones. Here is the track, and here are the people who are getting out. Here are the Germans, and here are the Jews. Here are the Jews with the striped things. Okay, I always, before I had this picture, I always used to say that we were a lot of people, but for me it was only my parents and me. We were standing there, not even talking, and then they said men in one way and women in another. And my father didn't move. And they said it again, and it started to go. Now I'm going to say it in Yiddish, and I will translate. And I said, Tata, me truk dich weg. Dad, they are taking you. And he said to me, you can take a picture of this later. Eine Sache sollst du nicht vergessen. Der Eibischter ist jeden a Tate. One thing don't forget. That the one who is above us, because we didn't say God's name for Bechinam, for nothing.
For nothing.
And that wasn't nothing. That wasn't nothing. That he is everybody's father. These were the last words, what he said to me, but then I didn't know that I'm not going to see him anymore. And then I was still with my mother. And the German asked me, wie alt bist du? How old are you? And I didn't answer, because I saw that on the other side, people are drinking water. And I was very thirsty. And as you see in the picture, it was a lot of people. It was a balagan. And when I came back, my mother was calling me. And I was going to go. She was on the other side. You know, there were two sides, one for a living and one for the death. But we didn't know. She was calling me, but one Jewish boy, a Polish Jew, got hold of me And he said to me, we all talked in Yiddish, don't worry. For the old people is much better. They get better food and they don't have to work. And you will see her. And till my mother, I could see her, he didn't let me go. He actually saved my life. But I didn't know it then. And poor woman, that's what she saw, that a strange man is holding on to me and doesn't let me go. That's what she saw. That was the last time.
The last time you ever saw her?
Yeah. Now we were taken to have a bath, and they took the hair from all of us, and from everywhere, and men were walking around, and we were naked, religious, we were not used to this sort of thing, and they gave us some gray clothes. They took us to a block. In the block there was a lot of people. We were in Lager A. And it was a noise. And the person who was responsible for the block, she was called the Blockertester, the one who... And she said, what is this noise? And she knew Hungarian, she was from Czechoslovakia. She said, what is the big noise? You should know that nobody is alive, only who is here. And we thought, she's mad. I mean, how is it possible? We just saw them. And they gave us bread. It was like soap. So the first day I didn't eat it. But boy, would I eat it later if I just would have had what to eat. I was actually hungry the whole year. Okay, in the morning, they count us, like it would be very important that we are there. Lines of 5, sometimes for hours. Winter or summer, we were standing there in one dress till the German came to count us. The first day I saw an SS woman. And I thought, it's a woman, I go ask her what's going on here. But I was lucky that an older person went up to her, apparently the same question, and she got beaten up. So that was my first lesson, that here you don't ask questions. After a few days, some girls whom we knew were working with the clothes that we brought, and the crematorium was nearby. And they came to the block in the evening, and they told us what they saw, what's happening. And then we realized that people are not alive anymore. But I still didn't know what happened to my father. I think that was the reason, one of the reasons I survived. Because I was hoping the whole time that maybe he is alive. I was given a number. You can't see, it's wrinkled.
Do you remember the number?
Yeah, I learned it the first day. I thought, and I don't know why, I didn't realize it's going to stay with me. It's an English A, 6766. I learned it because I was not Rosenberg at the time there.
A number.
I was a number. If they wanted me, they didn't call me by name, they called my number. So after a while, we were chosen 20 girls, and we went to Auschwitz every morning. That's about 3 kilometers. And the evening we came back. We worked on the fields and in gardens of SS. And then when winter started to come, we were taken to, again, you had to stand naked, and they were coming to see, like, I had some kind of a sore on my stomach, and you had to put your clothes on one side, everybody on the same side, and I put it on the other side to cover. And I remember, I don't know if she was Jewish or not, I think she was, a doctor. She picked up the clothes and put it back. And that's how I arrived to Auschwitz. It was for a very short time, but the situation was much better than in Birkenau. Can you imagine that we had a blanket? Everybody had a blanket. We were working in a matpera where people were correcting clothes. But not that was a short while, because we heard already the Russians. We heard the shooting. I even said to a friend of mine that maybe we should hide between the clothes, but she didn't have the guts, and so I didn't. And we were, no, but I forgot something very important. Some girls were working in a factory of ammunition, and they stole some ammunition. And they sent it to the people in Birkenau, to the people who work in the crematorium. And they blew up the crematorium. It was a bit too late, and then it stopped the killing. But the girls were caught, and we had to watch. We had to stand there and to watch. 2 were hung in the morning and 2 in the evening, that people who should see who work in the morning and people who work at night. I remember one girl, they told us to look. I mean, you can't do with anybody, to look to a certain place if you don't want to. But I saw the girl walking towards the place. She was a beautiful girl, and she was so proud. So they took us for the Dead March. That was in January, the beginning of January. It was very cold.
This is 1945.
And we were 25, and we were not very well dressed. I don't know exactly for how long, but more or less about 2 weeks we were walking. If somebody didn't say that I can't, there was one German who was actually quite decent, and he said, maybe you want to try. And the person said no. So they said, stand aside, and we just heard the shooting. They didn't leave anybody alive. We arrived to Ravensbrück. Obviously, we were lying on the floor, and when you woke up, on one side somebody was dead, on the other side somebody was dead. It was just a normal situation. That was in Germany already. We were there about a week, and from there, in open carriages, they took us to Neustadt Glewe. By then, we were already quite in a bad state. There we didn't work anymore. If we got little food during all the year, there it was almost nothing. So far so that when I got freed, I was 25 kilos. If it would last another few days, I don't think I would have made it. One day, a girl comes into the place and says, you know, it's quite amazing. The Russians are counting the Germans. They are standing in a row and they are counting. Then we realized that we are actually free. But I had no strength to get up. I remember myself sitting in a corner there in a room, and I thought to myself, okay, what do you do now? Where do you go? Then about 60 girls and boys decided that we go back to Hungary to see who is alive. We still had hope. It took, from May, it took till November that we arrived to Hungary. It's a long time. By then I was 16. Arrived to Budapest. The first thing was I went to see the list, people who came back, and my father wasn't there. Then I had many, many questions. Lama, why? And you know, where was God? But you know, I was alone. And I got a very religious upbringing. And you had nobody else, just him. If you lose him too, so what do you have? But I would forgive them for all the suffering, but not for the killing. Not for the killing. You know, in Birkenau, they murdered more than 500,000 children.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about adults and my parents, and my whole, no aunts, no uncles, and all. I mean, all in all, 10 cousins with me together survived from the whole family. I have a sadness in me all the time. That I smile, not that I put on a show, but no. It is with me all the time to think of it, that they made dust out of my parents and out of 6 million Jews. I mean, it's difficult for me. איך נפרדים? How do you depart from loved ones? How do you choose your way to go? I mean, you have got, this is not an exact translation, but there is a certain spot where you want to arrive. And there are 2 ways. And you don't know which way is better. And you don't know which one to choose. And how do you say thanks for this beautiful family that I was blessed with?
Thank you so much, Rael, for sharing your story with us. Justine, if we could share the next slide. So we have a photograph to share with you here at the request of Rael. This is a family photograph of Rael pictured just off center in the middle of the photograph with her 3 daughters and all of their families. And I thought it was such an appropriate image to share after listening to Rael's testimony, because Rael was an only child. She lost both of her parents during the Shoah and went on to rebuild her life. She married Moshe. They had 3 beautiful daughters, and this is their family. And it bears testament to the amount of souls that were lost in the Holocaust, not only the victims, but their future families. And I know that Rael's family is incredibly special to her. I'd also like to thank Les Glassman again, who's with us on the call, for allowing us to share this beautiful testimony of Rael. The full testimony
Ollie, you're muted.
my apologies. We will share the full testimony on the YouTube channel in the link on the chat. I'd like to say thank you to Les. This interview is so special to us because it allowed Rael to tell her story and her experiences during the Shoah, and in doing so, she really encompasses the full story of so many victims in the Shoah. She starts with her life before the Holocaust and her childhood, her beautiful, loving childhood in Hungary, the way that her family were deported to a ghetto, the way that they were deported from there through cattle trucks to the death camps and went through forced selection and then forced labor, her experiences of the death march and ultimately liberation, and then having to rebuild her life after the Holocaust and what was left, trying to get back to Hungary, trying to get back to her old home, and eventually making her way to the land of Israel. In this full interview, Rael encompasses topics such as religion, family, love, loss, and so many important topics. And I'd like to also point out that we shared in her clip today a short segment about Rael's witnessing of the Sonderkommando uprising, which happened in October 1944 in Birkenau, where one of the crematoria was destroyed by the Sonderkommando in a huge revolt, in an act of resistance, in a revolt that ultimately stopped the working of that crematoria. And Rael was an eyewitness to that part in history, which still has a massive impact on the history of the Holocaust today. So I'd like to now cross over to Rael and her 2 daughters, Miriam and Tova, who are coming to us live from the old city of Jerusalem. There's Miriam and Rael, and I can't help smiling when I see Rael because I had the honor of meeting her 2 weeks ago in Jerusalem, and she's as beautiful as ever, with a smile that could light up a room through the video. So Rael, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here.
I'm grateful, and I would like to know if there are any questions, so everything is very clear.
Wonderful. Rael, can you tell us a little bit about your experience of sharing your testimony with Les Glassman in your home?
לספר את הסיפור לדייס גלאסמן בבית. איך זה הרגיש לך לשתף אותו?
Listen, since then, that was a few years ago, since then, this year, I don't think I ever spoke so much like this year. And it's not because of me, it's because there are not too many people who still can tell the story.
We are so grateful that you have shared your story with us. I'm sure that it can be very, very challenging. Who do you speak to when you share your story?
With school, I used to go to schools and speak to the children. Now the children come to me.
And can you tell us, how did you make your way to the land of Israel?
I went to school. I learned in Beit Yaakov. And then the Russians started to take over Hungary.
This is in 1948.
That was in 48. And they were marching there with red flags. I said I had enough of this. I saw the Hungarians singing and marching and making fun of the Jews. That was the time to leave.
ושמעת שילד אומר שהתחילו מדינה.
There was a boy who was shouting, and we heard that somebody shouting that Israel became a country. It was a great joy, and that was the story.
אז איך הגעת לאונייה?
I came with a boat. It wasn't a luxury boat. It was much less than that, but we arrived. I was 2 weeks in a camp, and I was grateful. They gave us food, and the rain, it was coming into the tents, but who could care? I wasn't yet 20. Now I would care.
Can you tell us about the certificate that you had to forge?
שאת שינית את התאריך לידה בשביל להגיע.
I tell you because that was the last children's transport, not youth transport, that let the Russians let out for Hungary. And I had to do something, and I changed it. I think, did I show it to you? Okay, I'm not showing it now, but I made myself younger. But afterwards I went and I put my hand on the knach, and I said I was born in 29. So, and as you see, I'm very, very, very old. 95 and a half.
And as beautiful as ever. We have some questions from the audience. One question is, after your liberation, when the Russians captured the Germans, how did you regain your strength?
איך אחרי שהרוסים שחררו אותם, איך הצלחת להתחזק? אחרי שהיית כל כך רזה וחלשה.
It's a good question because nobody was waiting for me with very good food. I was eating bread and potatoes. And then I started to look after myself. I didn't want to get fat. I never wanted to get fat.
And where did you were 16 years old when you were liberated. Can you tell us, where did you go after that? And did you try and go back to your home?
האם חזרת לבית? מה עשית בגיל 16?
Okay. First, I met my cousin. I don't know if you said it. And first we decided to go to Tokaj, to my town. And the person didn't let us in. But I was told that there are holy books in an empty Jewish home. And I knew the books, but I didn't know how to take it and where to take it. But I found my father's handwriting, and that's the only thing what I have from home. I don't have pictures. I don't have anything.
That actually leads me
But
to the
now
next
I have
question.
a wonderful family.
You do. So for the audience to know, in the full interview with Les Glassman, Rael does show this book that she takes with her father's handwriting. So you can see it in the YouTube clip. Rael, can you tell us just briefly, since you didn't have pictures of your parents that you lost during the Shoah, the amazing story with the illustrations of their faces?
שאת עשית, ביקשת שיציירו לך.
No, I know. It wasn't me. It was my daughter, Toma, who was after 50 years after the Holocaust. He said, you have something in your memory. We have nothing. And he brought somebody who was very, very capable. It's not a photo, but it is a picture, and it is similar. And that's what I have.
Thank you so
These are
much
my
for
father-
sharing.
These are my father's parents and my father's grandfather. And evidently my father My father looks just like his grandfather. But my mother had no photos, so these are the photos.
Thank you. That was drawn by a forensic artist based on your mom's memories. And there's another question from the chat. Where did you meet your husband, Moshe?
איפה פגשת את אבא?
Okay. I see you want some romantic story.
אבא שלה היה איתי בבית ספר.
I learned together with his cousin
In Budapest,
in Budapest.
after the war.
And he lost a father, 5 sisters, and a brother. He was beforehand a yeshiva boy. And he came to say goodbye to his cousin, but the cousin wasn't there. So I spoke to him, and apparently, I don't know.
That's wonderful. There's a question.
Apparently, he found the discussion interesting.
And he saw
But he
your
came to
beautiful
fight.
smiling.
He came to fight in the War of Liberation. And afterwards, he went back to South Africa, and he became a really high leader of the Hebrew, not only in the Cape, but all over.
Absolutely. Myra was telling me that he also bar mitzvahed boys in the community. So there's a question.
הוא לימד בנים בר מצווה, היא אומרת. מיירה, עכשיו מה?
There's a
What
question. There's a question about survivors marrying each other. Since you and Moshe were both survivors, did you find a deep connection having both been through the Shoah?
האם זה היה ששניכם עברתם את השואה, שזה עזר לכם להתחבר?
He was in Hungary in a labor camp. He wasn't in Auschwitz. But it wasn't a luxury hotel, the labor camp either.
We have one more question, which is, how does a person who experienced such terrible horrors get out of that experience with such a beautiful smile, sparkling eyes, and a happy panim, a beautiful face?
זאת אומרת, איך מישהו שעובר כזה גיהנום, יוצא עיניים שמחות והפה ספרי, יצא כל כך שמח עם פנים פורנות.
Listen, if I would look and be very sad and complain all the time, would you talk to me? You would? But I don't know if people would come and visit me.
I think you have a natural joy that you can convey.
It's not always simcha. It's not.
I understand, and
But
you
that's the
do
way
say
I
that.
am.
Thank you. You are so brave and courageous and beautiful, Rael. Miriam,
Thank you.
Miriam, is there anything you would like to add, maybe about your experience in South Africa?
Well, I would. Firstly, I want you to know that my mother was born after 16 years of marriage. So she was like this wonder child that they just adored. So she had a lot of that. And, you know, when I was growing up, there wasn't much mention of the Holocaust. And there wasn't a Holocaust museum. And there were very few of us that had any connection to the Holocaust. There's Rabbi Dushinsky. There was, in my class, Leah Laser, whatever. And Tanya Gutta. There were a few people, you know, we went to school with your dad, but it was very not really there. We were very, it was rare to find people that had experience. We didn't have peer group. We didn't have a peer group, so whatever. Yes. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. It was like a dissonance, and that when I knew that Myra had started a Holocaust museum, it meant a lot to me. And just before the corona, I flew to South Africa And that was one of the things I wanted to go, and I went to see the museum. That was really important to me. More than, forgive me, more than Herzliya School or University of Cape Town, that was what I wanted to do. And I met your father also.
Yes, I remember coming to Israel on my first ever trip to Israel in grade 1 and coming to meet you and your family. And you mentioned the family of Pinchas Gutte as well, and it actually is Pinchas's 92nd birthday today. So it is a small world.
Mazal tov, mazal tov. Abba
Yeah.
shel Tanya Gutte ben 92 היום.
מזל טוב.
So Miriam, before we cross over to our next speaker, Mitch, is there anything else that you would like to say before we go? Anything from Rael?
Me or Mitch?
No, we were going to cross over to Mitch. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
אני חושבת שהיא שואלת אם האורח השני רוצה להוסיף משהו.
Okay, so on behalf of the Cape Town Holocaust Center and everyone who's joined us tonight, we'd like to thank you both so much for being here today. It's been such a joy to see you and to hear your story. And there are some really beautiful comments and memories that you can find in the chat of this webinar, which we will send to you. So thank you very much. And now we will cross over to Mitch, our next speaker. So we'll put Miriam on mute. Thank you. Okay. Let me introduce our next speaker. So our second speaker for this webinar is Mitch Kreitenberg, coming in from America. Mitch is a second-generation Holocaust survivor who will recount the story of his father Mike's amazing journey to survive in Auschwitz and a death march, as well as his family's incredible discoveries in the Auschwitz Album. Mitch is a graduate of the Seminar for Educators at Yad Vashem, and he now works as a docent at the Holocaust Museum, LA, where he gives tours to donors and special groups, as well as numerous school groups. Mitch is a lifetime resident of Los Angeles, where he's married to his wife, Pamela, and together they have 3 children, 3 grandchildren, and I believe a 4th one on the way. We were so delighted to have Mitch and Pam visit our Holocaust Center just a few weeks ago, where Mitch identified his family in some of our display, and you can see that photograph on the screen. And we will now hear Mitch's presentation of his family and their connection with the Auschwitz Album. Again, if you have any questions for Mitch, please feel free to write them in the chat or the Q&A. Thank you very much, Mitch.
Thank you, Orly. That was very nice. Wow, that's going to be a tough act to follow. That was an amazing videotape that we got to watch and question and answer period. Good morning and good evening to all of you, depending on where you are in the world. Yes, I did get a chance to go to the Cape Town Holocaust Center approximately 6 or 7 weeks ago. I got to meet Orly. I got to meet Jacob, the director, both terrific people and a terrific museum, and I encourage any or all of you to get a chance to visit over there when you can. What I'm going to do is very quickly run through, as quick as I can anyway, my father's amazing story of survival from Auschwitz, and then talk to you about an amazing discovery that my family was able to make. I call my presentation Finding a Needle in a Haystack, and it'll become apparent as we go through why I call it that. And again, it goes to the amazing discovery that we were able to make in the early 1980s. That's a photograph of my father and I, probably 15 to 20 years ago, just to give you all an idea of what we look like. This is a family tree, my father's family. My father's name was Mike, or at least Mike in America. And he was the middle child of 5. His father was Chaim Elia. His mother was Chaya. They grew up and lived in a town called Tacheva in Czechoslovakia, which for short was also called Tach. And my father was born in 1927. By 1939, the Nazis awarded that part of the world by the Carpathian Mountains to Hungary. So that's how they came under Hungarian rule. They loved being Czech. They did not like the Hungarians very much. What I'd like to do is go through each member of the family here and give you a quick summary of what happened to them. The family in 1944 was the Nazis came through, and after Passover of 1944, they were forced into what was called the Tach Ghetto. There were 5,000 people in this small farming town, approximately half of them Jewish. They got along very well with their neighbors, but again, they were forced into a ghetto, a small area of the city. My father and his family lived in a barn. They shared a barn with another family, lived there for approximately 6 weeks until they were put on train cars and sent to Auschwitz. That journey took approximately 2 days. And when they got there, I will describe the events as I said what happened. My father's father, my grandfather, Chaim Elia, he was a shoemaker and shoe repairman in Tach. He was allowed into the camp to work. He went into the camp with my father, Mike, and with his younger brother, Joseph. In approximately October of 1944, around the time of the holidays, he was selected out as no longer able to work, and he was taken away and gassed by the Nazis. My father's mother's name was Chaya. She was a seamstress for women's clothing in Tach. When they first arrived at Auschwitz, she was sent to the gas immediately, along with my dad's sister, Suri. Suri and Joseph were actually twins, but the Nazis never found that out. At the time they got there in 1944, Joseph and Suri were 14 years old. My father was 16. Suri would have been allowed to go into the camp to work. However, she didn't want to leave her mother. As you know, I think we can all understand, for a 14-year-old girl in a very stressful, difficult situation, she wanted to go with her mom. And, you know, nobody knew what those choices meant in terms of whether it was a good thing or a bad. Obviously here, that was a bad. So she went to the gas chambers with her mother. Joseph, who I said was 14 years old, he survived. He was with my father, Mike, the entire time that they were in camp until they were separated after the death march, which I'll talk about in a moment. My dad, as I said, was 16 years old. Mike and Joe got to work as trash collectors and trash sorters. That was their job at Auschwitz. They get up early in the morning, go through the roll call. They were taken to a trash dump, and they were told to separate metals, because as most countries, they were separating metals out for the war effort so they could build more bullets and bombs and trains and planes and ammunition, etc. The reason my father always said that was a good job was because he was able to find scraps of food in the trash, which helped him, you know, able to survive. If he saw a thrown away piece of chicken or anything else in the trash, it was much better than the piece of bread and lousy soup that they were being served. So that helped him and Joe to remain a little bit stronger. My father's tattoo, A10193. As we heard from the first speaker, that became their identity, another form of dehumanization. Nobody called my dad Mike or Mendy, as he was known then, unless it was a friend or family member. He was simply known as A10193. Yitzhak was 2 years older. He was 18 at the time. When they first came into the camp, the Nazis asked whether anybody had experience working as a blacksmith. Yitzhak was a big, tall, strong guy. He had never worked as a blacksmith, but he decided that he was going to volunteer with a friend. They went off to that job. My dad never saw or heard from him again. Obviously, presumably murdered by the Nazis. My dad always believed that they chose him to work in the gas chamber or in the crematorium because they used big, young, strong men to do that. The oldest brother was Sam. He was 20 years old, but Sam did not go to Auschwitz. Sam was taken by the Hungarians for slave labor prior to the family being deported. It was very difficult, as you heard from the first speaker, but he was able to survive. And in fact, the three members of the family that survived and came to America in 1947 were Sam, Mike, and Joe. And I grew up with all three of them. Each one of them had three sons. There were 9 male Kreitenbergs born to them. I have 2 brothers and 6 male cousins from this Kreitenberg family. After they left Auschwitz, they were of course forced on a death march. As you heard already this morning, if you couldn't keep up on the march, they would shoot people. They made it after 2 days into a town called Auschwitz, about 40 miles back into Germany. Then they were put on open boxcars and shipped for almost a week deeper into Germany, where my father arrived into the camp called Dora Nordhaus. As he got off the train there, he was able to go down to a river quickly to drink some water. It made him really, really sick, deathly sick. When he was in the camp, the river was polluted. When he was in the camp, he was sitting in a room near death. A Nazi officer walked up to him and said, "What's your name?" And he answered, "Kreitenberg." And for some reason, the Nazi officer saved his life, took him to shelter, which basically they called a hospital. It was a blown-out bunker, gave him some food, saved his life. My dad never really understood why he saved his life. He always thought that perhaps the name Kreitenberg, being a Germanic name, meant something. I've learned in my research at Holocaust Museum in LA that many of the Nazis at that point, who might have been religious or Catholic or what have you, they maybe perhaps realizing that they were doomed to go to hell and decided to save lives. It's possible that occurred also, but of course, never really knew how or why that happened. When they did get to Dora Nordhausen, and my father, like I said, was very ill, Joe was separated from him. He had to march on to Bergen-Belsen. He's told me he never thought he was going to see my dad alive again. After the war, the Jewish people that were in the camps, of course, didn't know what to do, where to go, but the word went through the camps just to go home, see who survived. My father was on his way back home to Teach when he was at a Red Cross building in Budapest, sitting on a couch, and his brother Joe walked into the room. And that's how they were reunited and realized that they were both alive. They went home back to Teach and met up with Sam there, as well as 3 aunts, 3 of my grandmother's sisters. My father and Joe were able to make it out to America on an what's called an orphans program under the age of 18. They were able to come to Los Angeles, where my father had a cousin. Sam and the aunts came out 3 years later. Some photographs of my father, so you can get an idea of what he looked like post-war here in America. The one in the center that's my dad, that's my Uncle Joe, and he was drafted into the United States Army during the Korean War. He was stationed in Europe, basically as part of the occupying force after World War II. And some more pictures. I believe the one on the right is from my bar mitzvah. That's the 3 brothers. And on the left, this is a photograph of Yitzhak. It was the only photograph they had. It was discovered later. Somebody had it and gave it to him. That's the only photograph that existed of him at the time, along with the other three brothers. I'm going to ask you to fast forward in time now. We're going to go from the early 1940s to 1982. Okay? In 1982, in April, I was reading this very copy of the Los Angeles Times newspaper, and it told about a story of a woman named Lily Meir. Lily Meir, approximately the same age as my father, from the same part of the world. She, when she was at Dora, happened to be the same place my father was. She was put into an American officer's barrack to get some rest in a nice bed. She was cold. It was January of 1945. She opened up a drawer to look for a blanket, and she found a photo album, which turned out to become known as the Auschwitz Album. I've already seen a couple of photographs of it. It was a handmade bound album, approximately 150 photographs in that album. Still today, the only photographs ever taken of Jewish people from inside of Auschwitz. I'm reading the newspaper article. She's looking through the book. To her shock and amazement, she finds a photograph of herself and her entire family photographed in the book. You have to understand how almost impossible this situation was. There was no photography allowed in Auschwitz. Trains were coming into the camp around the clock for periods of years. Estimated over 1 million people murdered at Auschwitz. 6,000 people being murdered a day. And to find these photographs is quite shocking. What did she do? She kept the album. A lot of historians not necessarily happy with that decision, but she kept it basically as a personal heirloom. Photographs were used to try Nazis at the Nuremberg trials because there were photographs of them there. She kept the book until she was convinced to give it up in 1982. The book made its way to, it's given to Yad Vashem, where they printed a replica called the Auschwitz Album. That's a copy of the book and what it looked like when I was able to go out and buy it, which I did that day. I went in, happened to be home. I told my father's house. I went to him and said, Dad, I told him the story about the finding and discovery of this Auschwitz album and the similarities between his story and the stories of Lily Meir. Of course, he wasn't interested. He spoke some about the Holocaust to us, to my brothers and I, if we asked him questions, but he never went into great detail and never really spoke too much of his experiences of the Holocaust. He wasn't interested. He said, no, what am I going to do with that? I have no interest. I don't want to look at it. I pretty much pleaded with him, and finally he agreed, fine, let's go get the book. So I went out. I think we both went out to buy the book, brought it home. I left it on the kitchen table, and I went off to my room to do what I was doing. Several minutes later, approximately 10 to 15 minutes later, my father calls me in. Mitch, come here. So come in, and he looks and shows me this photograph that's on the screen. And he looks at this man right here, and he says to me, I think that's my brother, Yitzhak. Of course, this was approximately 35 years later or so, and he hadn't seen his brother, of course, in all that time, and didn't have anything except for one photograph that I earlier showed you. My dad was pretty much in shock. My mom told him, she was home also. She said, Mike, sit down, relax, take it easy. So, of course, now he's very interested in the book. I go back off. He calls me in again, shows me this picture of the man in the cap. He says to me, who does that look like? I very quickly said, it looks like my Uncle Sam, because it did. The older brother who was in Hungarian slave labor. He wasn't at Auschwitz. So how could that be? My father, I mentioned that to my dad, and he said, well, Sam grew up to look like our father. That's my father. I had the very first look of my life of my grandfather. I never knew what he looked like prior to that photograph. See the photograph. Again, my dad sits down with the book, takes some time. He has a magnifying glass out at this point, calls me in for the third time, and he finds a photograph of himself. That's him right there, between the men with between the two men with the hats. Anybody who knows my dad knows that that's my dad. And in fact, you could see he's standing shoulder to shoulder in line with his older brother. He also discovers that his younger brother, Joe, who I told was 14 at the time, standing right in front of his father. This is, again, shocking. I saw goosebumps on my father's arms like I've never seen on a human being before or since. Really, truly a shocking, amazing discovery. Continues to review, go through the book, and comes up to this photograph. Some of you may be familiar with this photograph because it's basically, CEO of our museum calls it an iconic photograph. She believes it's because of the look in the eyes of children. It's in many museums. It's on the wall at Yad Vashem in Israel. It's on the wall in Los Angeles. It's on the wall at the National Museum in Washington, D.C. It's blown up life-size in block 4 at Auschwitz, because if you've been to Auschwitz, the lower block numbered buildings are where the museum is housed, pretty much like 1 to 10. My father was housed with his younger brother and father in block 6. So how ironic that this is blown up life-size in block 4. And of course, when we were visiting the museum in Cape Town, my wife Pam walked into a room ahead of me and said, "There it is," pictures on the wall in Cape Town as well. And this is my grandmother, who I described to you, Chaya. And this is Suri, the little girl who I said wanted to go remain with her mother. One of my daughters is named for her, Shira, and she carries that name and identity very proudly. You can see the train car right behind them. You see that now. I'm gonna let you take a look at this for a moment. If it was confusing before, I have this in here to show you clearly with the arrows who is who in the family. And that's a close-up of my father in line. My father and his brothers are able to identify pretty close to 100 people from the town of Tach, and gave that information to Yad Vashem in Israel, in Jerusalem. And I went there in 2019 to give them this. Well, we had given the information. It's a longer story back in the 1980s, but Yad Vashem apparently misplaced the information. I went back to give it to them in 2019, and they treated our family basically like royalty. They followed us through the museum and took photographs of us and presented us with an album when we were done. Here's the picture showing arrows to my grandmother Chaya and my aunt Suri. That's a photograph of, I'm on the right, my brother Ernie is on the left, and my son Ben, and we're standing in Yad Vashem in front of the photograph of the women. And when we were done with our talking to them about the identifications, they actually said, "We have a surprise for you." They put me into an elevator, took us down to the basement, walked through 2 high security card keyed rooms into a small little room. A man, freezing cold room, man with white gloves walks in with a box, opens it up, and allows us to see the original Auschwitz album, the album that Lily Meir found at Dora Nordhausen in January of 1945. And I believe that probably this album was carried by a Nazi officer on the same death march that my dad was on, because of course the album was shot, in May of 1944 when they were first deported to Auschwitz, and it wound up at the same camp that my dad was liberated from for Nordhausen. This is the original V album with, you can see wax paper dividers. There were also the person who put this book together put it into chapter form: arrival of the Jews, selection of the Jews, able-bodied men for work. It was basically, we don't know really what the purpose was going to be, as Orly said at the beginning, perhaps a history of the Jews that came through here. This is the page that has the photograph of the women, the original photograph, my grandmother. Here is the original photograph, a little 3x5 photograph with a white border that contains, my father's photograph as well as the rest of the family. That's me visiting, as I already showed you earlier, pointing out the picture that's on the wall at the museum. It's my father and I again. My dad passed away approximately 7 years ago. He used to speak to, after we found the Auschwitz album, he opened up. Then he started telling us stories. He was willing to go speak to schools, in particular, my children's schools. And I used to go with him, and I used to videotape him and answer questions for him. And he, as his memory faded, I became more involved telling the story until the end. Basically, I would go and tell the story. That's how I got involved with this. That's how I eventually became a ghost at our museum. And I'd bring my father along, and he would show his tattoo to the kids. Final screen, that's my father in the middle. Again, I believe this photo's from my bar mitzvah. There's my Uncle Sam. There's my Uncle Joe. 3 survivors, 80 descendants. And to me, that's just incredible that these 3 men coming to America without a penny in their pocket, without knowing a word of English, now have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren totaling 80. Just incredible, I think, to show the importance of one life. And, when you think about 6 million lives that were taken, it's really, of course, very sad, but at least they were able to survive, again, like I said, and have 80 descendants in today's world. I thank you very much. Thank you all for tuning in to listen to me. And I'll send it back over to Orly.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for taking the time to share your story with us. I know we had discussed earlier about the time frame to share your story, and you had told me that there's so much to say it could be expanded even longer. So for the sake of this webinar, we had to keep it to about 20 minutes, but perhaps in the future we'll do a webinar just focused on expanding your story.
Hope I didn't go too long today.
Not at all. We actually have a question in the chat about your mother and how did your parents meet?
Okay. My mother was American born, so that's kind of an interesting factor. I think it's true, as we heard earlier, that most Holocaust survivors married each other. But my mom was from Detroit. She moved to Los Angeles young. And as it turned out, she was living in a duplex. And my mother's parents owned the building. And my father's aunt and uncle, one of the aunts that survived, bought the building. And through those proceedings, they met each other and they got married. And I think that's one reason maybe why, perhaps why we had less talk about the Holocaust, in our home growing up. I mean, my dad was so good-natured and happy-minded and spirited about everything. It wasn't his nature to dwell on that anyway, but there wasn't the talk that I think probably existed in a lot of other homes when you had 2 Holocaust survivors.
I think it must have varied from home to home, whether people felt that they should share their story with their offspring or protect them from that story. Either way, I think there was probably intergenerational trauma. how was it for your parents, your mother, to be married to your father in terms of his story?
You see, quite honestly, it never came up that much. It really didn't. I don't know if they spoke to each other privately about it. I don't know, but I never saw it. I don't think I ever saw any discussions really about the Holocaust in my family, just generally hanging around, sitting in the den at the kitchen table. It never really happened. It never happened unless my brothers and I perhaps raised an issue or asked a question. It just really wasn't. I mean, I know people who've told me, my age, that their parents wouldn't allow them to wear a striped shirt because it brought back memories, or that their fathers or parents couldn't talk about it. I mean, mine didn't, chose not to, and chose to leave our life out of it. But obviously, it was there all the time. It just really wasn't a large part of my childhood in particular.
I think it's amazing that you ended your presentation in a similar way to the way that we ended our session with Rael, in sharing this fact that your family went on to focus on survival, on rebuilding, on having their families, and expanding their families, and the very tragic aspect of the loss of souls during the Holocaust, but their absolute focus, the ones who survived, their focus on life. Which is really, really beautiful. As I was watching you present, it struck me that, of course, Rael would have been in the camp at the same time as your father and his siblings. So they were all there together. However, we don't know that Rael is photographed in the Auschwitz album. There's a question about whether other families have also identified their loved ones in the album. And I think the answer is yes. Do you know of any in particular on your side?
I do. But one important thing you have to realize, everybody, is that these photographs are only taken across a couple of days. I wanted to mention that. So, I mean, that's the other miracle of it. When I was pointing out how many people went through, how many people were murdered there. The experts now believe, at first they thought it was one day, excuse me, but now it's believed it was over the course of maybe a couple of days and maybe a couple of transports. We're talking about a tiny, tiny portion of the people who went through Auschwitz. I mean, unless you knew that you were there on that given day in May, you're not going to have been not going to appear in the Auschwitz Album. It's very rare. Yes, I do know at least one other person who my parents were friends with, who I grew up with, who photographs in the album. And I've heard other stories, from various people here and there, but they were really all from either the town of Tate or from one or two other very local towns to Tate, and really only that deportation. It's also believed, I learned at Yad Vashem, that because these days were going to be photographed, it's very possible, for example, in the photographs, you don't see any dogs. You don't see German Shepherds. You might see a couple of rifles, but you don't see a lot. They did not want to photograph, beatings or killings and that sort of thing. So it might have been toned down. I mean, it was still, horrific, of course. My dad always described it that way. It might have actually been dialed down a little bit for the photographs on those 2 days.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what happened. And for those of our listeners who has visited the center during our run of the exhibition Seeing Auschwitz, which is an international exhibition curated by Paul Salmons, that is exactly what that exhibition says, that the Nazi officers or photographers who took those photographs wanted to portray a very specific message on the efficiency of the program of the decimation of the Hungarian Jewish community, as an example of how one does the selection process onwards towards mass murder in the camp. And therefore, it does not show any of this abject horror of the people who were actually experiencing this. And I think what's so wonderful about your presentation and the exploration of the Auschwitz album in general, which I'm very interested in, is how to restore the humanity to the victims who were nameless and faceless on that platform, to the photographers who had free agency to wander around that platform and that ramp and into the camp while people were waiting to be gassed, while people were being desanitized. They had free agency to walk around the camp and photograph their victims, but of course the victims were limited in where they could be and what they could do. And by you sharing your story and these photographs, we were able as an audience to give the humanity back to these people and who were seen as worthless, of life, unworthy of life. And I have a question for you around seeing your family's photograph in block 4 that you mentioned was life-size, because we have one life-size image in our exhibition, which is of the Birkenau Grove, where people who had been selected for death are told to wait ahead of them being taken to the undressing chamber, mostly because the gas chambers and the crematoria were overloaded during this mass deportation of the Hungarian Jews. And so you see them waiting in the grove. And we had a descendant, Leslie Weiss, coming to visit the exhibition about 10 years ago. Her mother, Irene Weiss, is a well-known survivor who's also pictured in the Auschwitz album. And Irene said that, like you mentioned, many of these photos are used in many museums across the world, including at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp as a memorial. She had never seen the pictures of her family life-size, and she wanted to thank us for showing her uncles and her granny, who were much younger at the time, how they would have been. So what was your experience of seeing your family life-size in that photograph?
Well, we knew it was there because I had some relatives go through before. So we knew it was there. We knew what to look for. So the shock value wasn't there necessarily because we knew what block it was in and we knew what it was. But what was interesting was there were high school Israeli students being toured through. And I believe they told us that, and this, again, this was back in 1991, actually. But we were told that all the Israeli high school students go on field trips to Auschwitz and go through. So my father started speaking to some of the kids and some of the groups, and then basically it was just a very impromptu, off the cuff. All of a sudden, he had an audience of 100 people in the room, and he was explaining to them his experience, and that he lived 2 blocks down with his father and his brother, and that's he said, "That's my mother, that's my sister." On the wall. I was actually videotaping a lot of it, so I was busy with that. But the videotape is amazing, not just in the sense of watching my dad, but in watching these people. Oh my God, they treated him like he was some sort of king or something. They were just, oh my God, and going up to him and wanting to kiss him and shake hands. It was really, really touching. And kept them there quite a while, asking them questions and such afterwards. That was a great experience.
Fantastic. And I think that for our docents who are watching the webinar right now, we will also be sharing your story like we will Rael's story in our exhibition for our learners who are going through the exhibition on a daily basis. Before we wrap up, I was just wondering if I could ask you what your experience has been being a teacher of the Holocaust at the Holocaust Museum of LA.
Well, I was asked to speak there once to make a presentation, and then of course they hit me up with being a docent. My wife Pam pushed me into it, but I was of course happy to do it, and I love it. I mean, I love going through talking to the students. Most of the students that we get in Los Angeles are not Jewish. A lot of time, this is their first introduction to Holocaust studies. Although many of the groups that come in are reading books. They're reading Night by Elie Wiesel or different books that they're going through in school. Many of them read The Diary of Anne Frank. So they have some familiarity with it. And I get, great attention from them. They're very interested. I also tend to do a lot of donor groups and other adult groups. The museum likes me to do it because they like me, showing my family photographs on the tours. And it's just terrific. I get people telling me all the time, I have goosebumps. Oh my God. And, questions from them. And like I said, I enjoy telling the story to the students, and it's a great thing. We're actually also we're in the middle of doing a documentary right now on my dad's story and about finding the photographs. And I told the film director that that's really my goal and purpose, is to be able to use this film for educational purposes, number one. And number two, to get the word out there and get the same, sort of reaction from people that as, I get when I tell the story. So, and when that's complete sometime next year, I'll make sure that you guys get that out in Cape Town as well.
I really hope that we get to screen it here in Cape Town. That would be absolutely fantastic. And I think it's so important that, you mentioned the story of Elie Wiesel, of Lily Jacobs Meir. These are famous names in the history of the Holocaust and in the family of survivors. And I think that it's so important that we also get to hear the stories of people whose names we haven't heard before, like the family of Rael and the family and your family as well. And thank you for giving us that opportunity and spending time with us this evening to share your story. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the webinar this evening or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. If you are not already signed up to our mailing list, please sign yourself up so that you may be informed of future upcoming webinars and events. Please feel free to visit our website and our social media pages for any of these upcoming notices. And thank you once again to our wonderful speakers. It's been a beautiful evening spent with you, and morning, Mitch. And thank you very much for supporting the center as we celebrate our 25th anniversary year. So with that, we will say goodbye. Keep safe, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.